Welcome everyone to the seminar series on forced migration. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. I am Aisha Chalar. I am a professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, University of Vienna, and I'm a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, IWM in Vienna. The seminar series is part of Europe-Asia Research Platform on Forced Migration, anchored at the IWM and the Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group in Calcutta, and is hosted at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Vienna. Our inaugural session was in November, so we have every month seminar. We will pause for February. Let me give you just a kind of a brief information what this platform is about in a nutshell. What the Europe-Asia Research Platform aims to address the multiple geographical and temporal dimensions of forced migration and explores the mechanisms, strategies, and challenges of labor and population movements and their governance from a global and post-colonial perspective. This is what we aspire to do. We aim to advance the cooperation between European and South Asian institutions and scholars while building a joint research platform for hopefully innovative knowledge production on forced migration and, of course, bordering regimes, which goes along. We try to bring to scholars, policymakers, and practitioners from different disciplines and regions, and with the aim of decentering scholarship, especially in the Europe-based scholarship, debates, and policies on forced migration. So there is an aim of intervention there for the decentralization of the scholarship on forced migration. In these talks, we focus on refugees and migrants as social, political, economic, and cultural actors. We have been discussing and continue to discuss various topics, including changing regimes and forms of governance of migrants and refugees, the solidarity networks and demands for social justice as entangled with increasing inequalities, austerity politics, racism, and populist politics and populism. The institutional components, we focus also, try to include the institutional components regulating and managing different forms of displacement and incorporation and exclusion of refugees and migrants from labor markets, protection regimes along the lines of gender, class, race. The seminar series on forced migration team members, apart from myself, are Anna Chukovic, coordinator of the research platform at University of Vienna, and Clemens Schmidt, who is providing us valuable technical assistance. It is a kind of so it is not your only institutional collaborations between IWM and Calcutta Research Group, but it is a collaborative project, even the seminar series. Without the help of Anna and Clemens, I don't think that we would be able to do that. And let me introduce our speaker, today's speaker. I'm very happy to welcome Prem Kumar Rajaram, who is a professor of sociology and social anthropology at Central European University. We have to put, I think, Budapest and Vienna. And he's the head of the CEU's Open Learning Initiative, OLIVE, which provides education pathways for people of refugee and backgrounds. his work. I mean, Prem is a long-time colleague, friend from CU, from my former workplace also. And his work centers on the intersection of race, colonial histories, capitalism, and migration, and how these may apply to understand and rethinking the boundaries and purposes of higher education. That is also the Olive Project, I think. I'm not going to refer to all those articles and reports, but I will just go backwards in terms of the some of the publications, in terms of the articles: Refugees as Surplus Population, Race, Migration, and Capitalist Value Regimes, 2018. And then I think that today's talk has some kinds of connections with that. And The Borderscapes, Hidden Geographies and Politics at Territories Edge, with Grundy War in 2007. He is the author of Ruling the Margins, Colonial Power and Administrative Rule, which came in from Routledge in 2016 book, and the co-editor of very often cited book Borderscapes, Hidden Geographies and Politics at Territories Edge, which came out from Minnesota in 2007. I will just add that Prem Kumar Rajaram is also a member of the executive committee of the EASA, European Association of Social Anthropologists. We are very happy that you can join us today, Prem, on our series of forced migration. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I hope you can hear me. Everything is fine. Thank you, everyone whom I can't see, for taking the time to come and to come to the seminar. I hope that I will be able to think with you and have somewhat of a one-sided conversation, I suppose, on some of these issues. But I look forward to your thoughts, your questions, your comments, your critiques. I'd also like to, besides thanking Aisha for the invitation and for this very nice seminar series, and I really like the way it's described. It really connects to my own interests and passions about how we should think migration. I'd like to thank Anna Djukovic for all the work that she's done. Thank you, Anna. And Clemens, whom I haven't met, but thank you. I know you're doing a lot of background work as well. So as I said, I would like to maybe try to overcome this odd virtual barrier, which I think we've all got perhaps sadly a little bit used to over the last few months, last year, to try to have a conversation with you, to try to talk to you about what I think the coloniality of migration is. I will show a PowerPoint. I will really, I'll try not to really, well, not to talk too much, and maybe to highlight key points, key conversation starters, rather than going in depth into the whole issue. But let me just start by trying to share my screen. I don't know whether you'll be able to see me then, so we'll be having a conversation with PowerPoint. Perhaps you can see me, I don't know, but okay. Sorry. What can you see, Aisha? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, I could see the PowerPoint, and I could see you also, which is good.
Okay. So this is a talk on the coloniality of migration. When Aisha asked me to speak on this topic, I wasn't sure what to do. And I wasn't sure what to do because this is what I want to speak on. But I have frankly avoided coming head on onto this topic for a long time. And I've avoided that because the way that I've approached the idea of coloniality of migration is through quite many years now of archival work, which has led me to, well, I would say sometimes to be confused about the nature of colonial power, of its multiplicities, of its contradictions, of the difficulty of really saying that this is coloniality or this is colonial power. I started going to the archives, which are the archives in the British Library, I think in 2014, and I started looking at cadastral surveys. I started looking at how geography and the law came together to create new imaginations of agriculture and thereby of agrarian laborers and of the agrarian economy. And then I moved towards, I went to the archives just at some point a few years ago, just wanting to do something about labor. I didn't know what I was doing. Through all sorts of investigations, I ended up focusing on famine, and then on sex workers, and then on indigenous laborers. And all of this pointed to multiple complexities, to me at least, of the coloniality of power. But it also pointed to a lot of reverberations to what I see in my other line of work, which has been on refugee studies and migration. That is the processes of what I will call and explain in a little while, the processes of cultural and bodily cheapening of people called migrants, people called refugees or forced migrants, seem to me very much of a piece to the cultural cheapening of people called natives in the colonial system. This cultural cheapening is basically a form of disenfranchisement, an articulation that the systems, the cultural and social systems of migrants were somehow inadequate. Inadequate as a means of grasping two forms of potentiality. Potentiality of their own body power and the potentiality of the resources around them. That is, following Marx, labor is a second order concept. It is a potential. And native social systems would take it to be unable to realize the potential of body power, or the potential of their body power, unable to take the step of translating work to efficient and productive labor. Similarly, resources and I suppose cultural meanings were or cultural systems, cultural artifacts were unable to realize their potential without the intervention of, in the colonial period, of a European gaze. This type of cheapening has been called, I think, in a large umbrella sense, and I'll try and make a critique of this, as the prelude to something called accumulation by dispossession, or primitive accumulation. These to me are large umbrella terms that are a little bit unsatisfactory because it doesn't take into account the contradictory, difficult dynamics involved in asserting, first of all, that colonial cultural systems could not realize the full, did not have a basis for effecting the full potential of the body power of workers, of the cultural artifacts of natives. And this process of cultural cheapening, this process of rendering people outside of the norm, outside of a certain polity, and the consequent capacity to undertake projects of hyper-exploitation. I do mean projects, and I'll try and explain what I mean later. Projects of hyper-exploitation seem to me to be very resonant with what you see with migrant laborers. And this is where I try to migrant laborers today, in the contemporary period, at least in Europe. And this is when I try to think about the concept of surplus population. And the concept of surplus population really rests on a rereading, a colonial, a Fanonian rereading of Marx's idea of the labor theory of value. And this basically means that it starts from the simple point that labor is a second order concept. It's a potential which needs to be taught. There is a series of micro processes that are undertaken on bodies, on working bodies, so that these may be translated into regulable, regimented, legally organized forms of labor. And And then the question comes, who is more likely to not quite be able to translate fully their body power into this cultural regimen of labor, into the ideas of productivity there. This idea that there were some people who could not quite approximate to the norm of productivity that is centered in the idea of labor, led me to ask, and not me alone, many people, many different ways, led me to ask, who is more likely to be rendered surplus? Who is more likely to be rendered as people outside of the cultural capitalist system? By outside, I don't mean outside as in cast off. I mean included through their exclusion as cheap and disposable labor. So that's a starting point, a certain idea of commonality, and I'll try and explain what I mean. And this idea of commonality for me when thinking about migration, and I follow the work of a lot of people, including Aisha's work on decentering migration in migration studies, which is basically the idea that, or the way that I look at it, is that there's sometimes, and there's been enough of a critique now, but there has been a tendency in migration studies to begin the study of migration, study of migrants at the ostensible point at which migration occurs, the act of mobility. This leads to a certain, well, in some work, including I think particularly policy work, in a disregard for the complex relations that have led to certain responses to what may be called imperial projects of domination. These projects include an attempt at mobility, but they include other things, an attempt to act different forms of political struggle, different forms of trying to evade and question well, what we could call an imperial political economic system. So migration is not, I think, to be studied in and of itself, but in relation to broader cultural and economic processes of domination, which center, I think, and I will try to show, on the cheapening of body power and cultural systems so as to enable the hyper extraction of value from certain bodies. Yeah. Basically, one way of saying this is that migration is made up of a series of relations. It is not the thing in itself, but a series of complex relations behind that. And then we can also see common marginalizations between people who are called migrants and other types of groups who are subject to this type of cheapening and hyper extraction of value from their bodies. These are often racialized others. In Europe, where I currently live, it's often Roma groups. So the commonality of the marginalizations of these groups is important, I think. And as a student reminded me a little while ago, by the commonality of marginalizations, we can mean two things. One, the shared or the similar forms of marginalization that racialized others and migrants encountered before cultural and capitalist systems, which point to their common forms of governance and not their separate forms of governance. But then the other thing is the sheer commonality of this, the way in which these become part of our gaze, so in ways that we don't notice them. They become the commonsensical ways of treating certain groups of people. And I'll try and explore what this means later. These commonsensical ways means that that for as far as refugees and forced migrants are considered, they're seen as through the lens of being a stranger, subject to a different form of governance, different form of social relation. And then from this, where do we see the coloniality of migration? And I've said this. I've said two of these things. I want to say a third thing. And despite my critique of the idea of the accumulation by dispossession, because it's a large umbrella term that takes in a whole series of multiple dynamics and contrary dynamics of seeking to control others, I use a umbrella term myself, which is social reproduction. But I think the idea of social reproduction is vastly different. And what I try to do is that I try to think that the coloniality of migration can be seen in the struggle to control the social reproduction of others, meaning the struggle to control and direct how life and body power is reproduced, but also how cultural systems are reproduced. And the struggle to control the social reproduction of others, of course, has multiple sides. It has, I think, a certain intent. And the intent is to ensure the social reproduction of, and I'll just say it's a bit simplistic, of a ruling elite. The social reproduction of others in order to maintain certain relations of rule. So what I will try and explore in this talk is what it means to control and direct the social reproduction of others, meaning the social reproduction of life, but also the social reproduction of the systems that give life value, the cultural systems, the modes of enchantment that we all strive in one way or another to elaborate, and the way in which these become subject to struggle to control. I'll get to that, hopefully. Behind this is a questioning of certain, honestly, I don't know how to pronounce this word, epochs, an epochal understanding of history. An epochal understanding of history is one that sees our time as being defined in terms of large statements about the age that we are in, an age of imperialism, an age of neoliberalism, even an age of migration. There's a very nice critique of this by Ranabir Samadar, the critique of thinking about the age of migration. And the problem with these ideas of age of migration is that it doesn't take into account the multiple dynamics involved in constituting the systems of power that are said to constitute an age. Basically, what are the multiple dynamics that seek to, multiple dynamics behind an imperialist political economy? For me, the idea of social reproduction, because it looks at the process and the struggle of ensuring the cheapening and control of the social reproduction of others, it opens up a series of ideas about the multiple dynamics. And here I follow Raymond Williams, the conjunctural idea of history, the conjunctural analysis, which lends focus to multiple and contrary dynamics coming into play at any given time in order to create structures of power. The other two things behind the coloniality of migration, which I won't get to because I've already talked about, is the persistence of imperialist political economy. Here I'm particularly influenced by John Smith's recent work and that by Intan Suwandi, who talked about how value chains seek to establish an ongoing imperialist economy. And basically the idea here is the creation of modes of valuing that enable the extreme, what I call projects of hyper extraction of value from the global south, leading to, of course, all sorts of social devastation, leading to what we recognize as migration. I've talked about the labor theory of value. I won't get into that again further. What I will do in this talk is try to illustrate these ideas with reference to three cases. I'll get to these cases quite quick. I won't spend a lot of time here. The three cases are two based on my colonial archival work and one a certain reading of European citizenship. One is to do with the control of the social reproduction of migrant or people, indigenous migrant laborers in tea plantations in early 20th century India. The second, the control of the spatial mobility of people identified as prostitutes or sex workers in colonial Rangoon. And third is European active citizenship. And what I try to do with these three, the first example is to talk about struggles of social reproduction, struggles of control, alternative modes of enchantment, alternative modes of giving meaning against capitalist systems of these, with the study of the control of the mobility of people identified as prostitutes. What I try and do is to try and talk about the cultivation of a civic and virtuous space, which is very important to the cheapening of native cultural systems. Natives cannot cannot be assumed to be able to acquire the civic competencies that are required to exist in a moralized space. And that's the point at which I turn to the idea of European active citizens, where I argue that there's a certain depoliticization and a culturalization of the European public sphere because of an emphasis on active citizenship, which meaning the acquisition of civic competencies. Let me just quickly isolate 4 points about what I understand by colonial power. First is the creation of the possibility of more or less free value extraction from colonies back to the metropole. I think that that's clear, but it's basically in the way in which colonial capitalism worked to extract value and to freely transfer it with as little what we recognize as tax or sanction as possible back to the metropole. This rested on, as I've said, the cheapening of the cultural and social systems and social formations of what people call natives, so that their hold over resources and their own body power could be seen as inadequate, enabling then these forms of hyper extraction of value, meaning both the extraction of value from bodies and from resources, and its transfer of value across chains in ways in which that there is very little leakage from these chains, these value chains, so that they enter into the metropole. This is the nature of contemporary imperialism, where firms seek places where value chains don't leak, so that as much as possible, usually a very large amount of the investment is returned plus the value that is gained. And that's, I think, an important part of contemporary imperialism. And then third, the establishment of a moral economy of work and production, where labor came to be associated with European productivity, a standard to which natives were doomed to fail. Yeah? Enabling then the possibility of cheap and often violent extraction of your body power and then disposability. I've talked about this. This is the idea of production of surplus. It's the idea that labor is a potential, a second order concept, and therefore ultimately a cultural concept to which people have to be taught, to be educated. And then, of course, it becomes institutionalized. It takes on a certain legalistic veneer as well. And it becomes the basis for an administrative and depoliticized form of functioning, so that the cultural ideology behind the idea of labor becomes difficult to discern. And here, the work of Said Farid Alatas, his work on the myth of the lazy native, is crucial. I recommend that to anyone. And the fourth aspect of colonial power is the wholesale, the large spatial and temporal reorganization of colonies, which means the two things. It means, of course, the ordering of space so that an unevenly deployed economic infrastructure can be used to extract resources and mobilize and then immobilize labor. Yeah. And the same thing happens with certain temporal reorganization. And this is something which many people have talked about, as Shahab Khosravi has talked about, I think, very nicely recently on the temporal denial of temporal coevalness of migrants, the creation then of a space that is marked by spaces of, let's say, modernity and order, and then spaces of the native, spaces of regression, of backwardness. And this multiple temporalities is important. I'll get to that in a little bit. this ordering of space and temporality enables a regulable form of exchange, whether labor exchange or monetary exchange. And this, this form of exchange represents the operation or exercise of virtue and virtuous society. What do I mean by that? I mean the establishment, for example, of modes of laboring, systems of exchanging your body power for cash, becoming regulable and legal, but also concealing a certain idea of virtue and the correct operation of these leads to the cultivation of virtuous society. The British in India had a very troubling term for this. They called it the moralization of the native. And they were always aware of the possibility of the demoralization of the native. In some of my other work, I look at famine labor, and the insistence by the British on not to give what they called charity to people starving because of famine. It wasn't natural famine, for fear that they would be demoralized, that they would go back to being native, that they would forget everything that they had learned about how to be a tangential part of the new cultural systems of labor. Okay, so that's what I understand by colonial power. I've talked about this, conceptualizing colonial power. I'm basically interested in the labor theory of value and the idea of social reproduction. I won't repeat that. I think the idea of accumulation and dispossession doesn't cover the multiplicity and dynamics of these processes. And just to highlight just very quickly once again, the colonial rendition of the labor theory of value asks who is more likely to be cheapened, to be articulated as surplus to the moral and cultural systems and therefore able to be cheapened, and who is not. And this was central to the logic of hyper-extraction, and I think also central to contemporary ways of governing migrants. In social reproduction, what's important is the struggle to ensure the production of cowed, docile bodies to be used in the production of surplus capital and value, but also in the reproduction of European cultural value. This was the basic point that Edward Said made. Orientalism was not only about the Orient, it was also about creating an idealized idea of the Occident, the idea of Europe as a space of virtue and of civilization itself. I want to one of the key ideas in reproduction for me is the idea of social reproduction. The control of social reproduction is that it's not simply the reproduction of life, but the reproduction of systems and frameworks of value and meaning. And here, this is Shahram Khosravi, who wrote about belatedness, the belatedness of the migrant. And for me, this is similar to the cultural cheapening. The impossibility of structures of enchantment, of giving meaning to others, to people who have been placed in a different cultural time. So he writes, I'll just read a little bit of it. People categorized as refugees, deportees, or undocumented use terms such as confusion, chaos, puzzlement, being lost, and darkness to express the precariousness they find themselves in when facing practices that keep them unconnected, not knowing, and unknown. Belatedness therefore means a predicament of being perpetually regarded and treated as foreigner. And what I'm trying to get at is that colonial capitalist systems were entire worlds. They were not even chiefly, but definitely not primarily, simply an economic system. They sought to cultivate an entire world to which people call natives could not be a full part of, because they were not able to fully approximate the ideas of virtue and so on, which became consigned to the European body. I won't get into this, this is just a summary. And I'd like to start, I'm sorry, I don't know why it's doing that. Sorry, I'm not very good with PowerPoint. I don't normally use it, but I want to move very move through these three cases to try to illustrate some aspects of colonial power, and to think about how it may relate to the idea of coloniality or migration. The first is something which I just call rebellion in the tea garden. This was a rebellion as a response to labor immobilization and restrictions on social reproduction. What I have written about recently in work that's hopefully will be published soon is a microhistory of a specific instance of rebellion. In 1915, in Northeast Bengal, a tea worker, a tea garden, a tea plantation worker, killed his wife and tried to kill himself. When he was asked why he was doing that, why he did that, he said that some of his fellow laborers tried to make him chant the name of the Germans, and that if he did not, the devil would come and kill him. The British were very much, this was 1915, sorry, I didn't put that. The British were very much concerned by the mention of Germans at work here. And further investigation by a special tribunal that was set up came to the conclusion that what this worker was talking about was a call by these Oran workers, which centered on asking Kaiser Wilhelm to come to save them and to kill the British. I won't get into details of this, but the British courts were a little bit stuck here. They tried very hard not to see them as agents, not to see them as agents of their own rebellion, despite the quite concrete lack of evidence of German missionaries being at work in trying to cultivate or foment rebellion. The British insisted and actually expelled the remnants of German missionaries. This was the war that many of them left. And what is interesting here is the insistence that these workers did not have the cultural and political mindset to be able to articulate agency. The whole thing was seen as something that was fomented by external European agents. But there are multiple ways of reading this, and the one way in which I wish to read this is that this was an attempt by Oran workers to struggle for the re-enchantment of the modes of laboring and modes of social reproduction to which they were subject. Oran workers were free laborers, not indentured laborers, unlike other groups, meaning that they were brought by agents from an area called Chotanagpur, excuse my pronunciation, by agents and middlemen to work on tea plantations under contract. These contractual forms, though they were not indentured, they were based on ensuring the immobilization of Oran workers. Oran workers were not easily able, and there was militation against them, freely selling their labor. That is, moving across tea plantations, seeking higher wages elsewhere. If this were done, tea plantation managers would seek to round them up with the assistance of the British. So Oran workers had this odd duality. On the one hand, they were governed by law as free workers. On the other hand, they were not allowed to move. And one of the reasons they were not allowed to move, or why in which that the British authorities felt that they were able to immobilize them, was because of ethnography, colonial ethnography. Colonial ethnography spent a great deal of time with the Orans, and it centered really in identifying, two aspects, and both of which became very important for the new agrarian economy. One was a sense of the superstition of Orans, based on a belief in devils and in witchcraft. An idea then that that cultivated a sense that Orans had a world view which was non-rational, influenced by superstition, influenced by conceptions of magic and unreality. On the one hand, this first of all led to the accumulation by dispossession of Oran land, leading then to their migration. Oran land became seen either as waste land or land that was available for timber and related things. So the Oran imprint on land through magic and superstition was seen as inadequate. This whole idea of the cultural cheapening of all of these groups. And so then this was one of the ethnographic views. The second ethnographic view was that Oran were well, the ethnographic view coupled with the anthropometric view fetishized Oran bodies. Oran bodies as strong strong bodies fit for forms of manual labor, and this led to a sense of the Oran as being fundamentally fundamentally tied to their body as opposed to their mind. And there's the whole mind-body distinction that was integral for the way in which colonial capitalism operated, not being tied to their mind. What this meant was that there was only so much that they could learn about labor. What they had was body power, very valued body power. Oran cost more to recruit and got higher wages than other groups because of this bodily labor. And this then enabled this idea of people connected or restricted to their body as opposed to their mind, led to a paternalistic, violent, and sometimes benevolent control of Oran laborers in coolie lines, basically in housing, which controlled their social reproduction, and which led to the provision of material goods so that they could continue to reproduce labor for the tea plantations. At the same time, though, and contrary to all of this, there were a series of Oran rebellions from the late 19th century onwards, which the British, on one hand couldn't understand, and at other times dismissed. And this persistence of rebellion, this persistence of questioning these systems, the rebellion centered really on three things until this thing about Kaiser Wilhelm, which was the new thing which completely threw the British. One was an insistence that they stand with their oxen. They would not till the land. They would not work their oxen. Yeah? The second one was that a certain moralizing thing, that they would not drink, that they would not partake of intoxicants. These types of modes can be seen, I think, and it's really hard to do that because we all know the colonial archive is over-determined by the British gaze, but it is possible to see their rebellions as modes of rethinking the structures of social reproduction to which they have been confined through ethnographic work and ethnography's, anthropology's function as a handmaiden in capitalism. So I would say that what becomes important here is really trying to see Oran's struggle as a struggle of re-enchantment, an attempt to recapture the modes of living in a dignified, in a way of giving meaning and value to what it is, to life and to social reproduction beyond the capitalist systems, which created a mode of enchantment to which Oran could only serve, but could not fully partake of. And it's similar, I think, with a lot of irregular migrants, people whose disposable bodies can be used to serve the broader enchantments of European capitalism, migrants and on tomato plantation, for example, in Italy, but without being able to fully partake in this enchantment. And then, of course, it creates this whole series of contradictory and problematic aspirations and values, which I might get into later, but I am aware of the time, and I want to move to a debate on prostitution at a similar time period, 1914, 1915. So prostitution, just to be very clear and very simple, prostitution was integral to military deployment. It was integral to the military control of problematic zones throughout colonies, and here particularly in British India, in Rangoon. The issue with prostitution, which kept being cropped up over and over again, had two aspects. One was hygiene, the extent to which soldiers, not the people identified as prostitutes, of course, soldiers were having their masculinity, their military masculinity, threatened by the lack of hygiene, not of them, never of them, well, usually never of them, but of the women that were identified as prostitutes. The second thing that came out occurred really towards the beginning of the 20th century in many parts of many colonies, ranging from the Dutch East Indies to India, which was the issue of the problem of the moralization of space, that space needed to reflect, the way in which space was ordered needed to reflect these norms, these European norms and value. They needed to create systems of exchange in space that would add up to some form of civic virtue. In Rangoon, these debates hadn't really hit home as yet. Rangoon was an outpost of British India, and prostitution was allowed in what was called segregated streets. And suddenly, and they had sheaves of documents about this, American missionaries turned up. American missionaries turned up, very troubled by the existence of these segregated streets where prostitution was visible. And then there was this whole lot of, the whole series of very millenarian type of letters being sent to the lieutenant governor, the British lieutenant governor, by American missionaries, warning him of the end of days if he allowed the spectacle of prostitution to continue. And this really went on. Women's groups in the United Kingdom got hold of this, and eventually they got the bishop in Rangoon involved, and then they turned, and finally the lieutenant governor had to deal with this. And he commissioned the police commission, and the police commissioner meticulously noted a number of in segregated streets, assuring meticulously a number of prostitutes in segregated streets and in non-segregated streets, assuring the close control through what he called the facial recognition index of prostitutes caught outside these segregated streets. So the assurance that they would be making people visible, and governable if they were to move beyond the segregated streets. But the lieutenant governor had a point. He said that visibility continues in the segregated streets. Rangoon was changing and growing. Different people were coming. European women were coming. Wives and daughters of administrators were coming. The spectacle of segregation, the spectacle of prostitution in segregated streets could not be allowed to happen. And then he did something which was a little bit odd. Segregated streets were banned, but prostitution was not, meaning that the spectacle of prostitution was banned. Brothels could not be made visible. And what's important here is the cultivation of a certain European moral sphere, the cultivation of virtuous space and a virtuous civic identity through the rendering of certain types of practices invisibilized and therefore private. And what I'm interested in here is the cultivation of European civic virtue, the idea of civic virtue and the spectacle of civic virtue through the the establishment of certain forms of exchange, the legitimation of certain forms of exchange through which civic capacities could be developed, and not the banning to a shadowy underbelly or to the sorry, I got a little bit tired. Banning to the shadowy underbelly of non-virtuous forms of exchange. And this is what I think you see in the European public sphere today. And I'll come to that in a little while, but I just want to say this is what you see in the differences between the front stage and the back stages of European capitalism. The front stage of European capitalism, I won't get into that, we know what it is, it's entrepreneurship, it's about free labor exchange. The backstage is the increased reliance on disposable labor of irregular migrants. And this is how capitalism reflects and cultivates a certain idea, or is connected to and reflects a certain idea of virtue. And this leads me to my last example, which I will be quite quick with. Oh, wait, I just want to show this because I thought this was interesting. The Lieutenant General Governor, agrees that for obvious reasons, it is undesirable that European prostitutes should be permitted to exercise their calling in England. It is, however, not possible to take any steps to deport them. It was in the middle of the war, First World War. The considerations which render desirable the deportation of European prostitutes do not apply to Chinese and Japanese prostitutes. The Lieutenant Governor is, of course, much too well spoken to explain why. But he does say that they are well conducted, meaning that they are not a threat to order. Yeah? But the implicit idea here is that they are people who can be exploited for certain reasons. They lack the virtue, the inherent virtue that European women, even European women prostitutes, have. And then he fears that any such step would be a further exploitation of young Burmese girls. And I think what's interesting here is, of course, the racial hierarchies, but also the imputation of different types of value. Young Burmese girls who needed to be protected, Chinese and Japanese prostitutes who were seen as outside of virtue, and European prostitutes. As an aside, if we look at Orientalist paintings and the way in which Arab women are depicted, as opposed to European women, we see this difference. The European woman is someone inherently said to contain grace and modesty, and then there's the counter. And well, I should stop talking, so I'm going to move on. European active citizenship. I'll say this just quite quickly. It's nothing terribly new. It's something which a lot of people have talked about, but I want to just emphasize a few points. So in the early 2000s, the European Union expressed various types of anxiety about the extent to which citizens of EU states also saw themselves as European citizens who supported Europe as a unit of democratic governance. So there was an anxiety. Citizenship was something which was tied through forms of economic mobility and economic participation, not in terms of civic connection. So then attention turned to the cultivation of active citizens, especially youth, especially students, through Erasmus and other forms of circulation. And active citizens were people who would participate in the public sphere with a view to the acquisition of civic competencies, rather than, for example, the transformation of political education. Yeah? Citizenship not as a rethinking of community or who we would live with, but the participation in European public fora and the demonstration and acquisition of civic competencies through that. What this does, of course, is that it creates Europeanness and European citizenship as a cultural good in and of itself. The idea of active citizenship fundamentally is based on a culturalization of the European sphere. The question becomes who is likely to be able to perform such civic competencies and who is unlikely to acquire and perform such civic competencies. This has two consequences. One is an increasing culturalization and depoliticization of the European public sphere, the growth of populism, the growth of an odd and troubling debate about what constitutes Europeanness. It leads to Ursula von der Leyen's troubling questions about protecting or promoting, they changed it to promoting a European way of life is one of the goals of her presidency. And it leads, of course, to the growth of right-wing populism, and because that's what European public space is. It's about who is more European. And then second, it leads to the restriction, the policing, the subtle policing of the boundaries of Europeanness and the invasion of these boundaries within, so that civic competency is seen as something which needs to be demonstrated and can't be demonstrated by people in all sorts of different fora, not just at the border, but in public spaces, in universities and so on. And this is perhaps most telling in the restrictions of the rights of mobility of people with refugee status or some form of refugee status, including the right to move for education. Yeah. So what I'm trying to get at here, that European active citizenship, is the elevation of civic competency and the cultivation of civic competency as a way of doing politics, with the consequence of a culturalization of the public sphere, because we have this idea of European values being something implicitly assumed. And then, of course, you have the populists like Viktor Orban and others who seek to say that, well, no, this is not Europe, this is Europe. But the idea of the boundaries of Europe and who can be trusted to perform or acquire such civic competencies is restricted. And this goes back, to my mind, and it's quite an extreme example, to the policing of people identified as prostitutes in colonial London, people who must not partake in the forms of exchanges that constitute a civic community. It is people who exist in the shadowy underbelly, people who are included through the exclusion. I want to end here. I don't have much of a conclusion. I've talked a little bit longer than I intended to. And I welcome questions, comments, critiques, and conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prem. That's okay. That is if you stop sharing your PowerPoint. Thank you very much for this, both theoretically, historically, and ethnographically also very rich talk. And it is a very overarching kind of a perspective that you're bringing in, that it's, I mean, to read several things in relation to each other, but under the umbrella from a kind of a particular kind of a lens. So I feel very close to it. And
thought you might.
yeah, and then actually when listening to you, it was very clear to me that's, I mean, why we wanted to have you two here. That's and to move our thinking and then the discussion, which was actually all the speakers until now that brought and it further. We have asked everyone to post their questions through the chat, but let me just add one thing, or it's not even a question, but maybe it is. One is a question, one is a comment. That let me start. In terms of that, your irritation or your critique to the accumulation by dispossession, saying that it just does not include the contradictions and then the kind of the nuances where that the culture, that what you call as the cultural cheapening is part of it. But my question would be, isn't this a kind of a isn't this what you're talking as the cultural cheapening, which is the kind of the devaluation, dehumanization that comes with all kinds of social relations where with the capital actually. And this is how that the appropriation works and has always worked. This isn't this what actually accumulation by dispossession tries to capture. Of course, there are, because of that kind of cheapening that what you're talking about, which is part of a value regime. It is and that cheapening is for the creation of extraction of value.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think that it is, it just depends on how you read accumulation by dispossession, because capital could never work without what you're talking as
Yes.
cultural cheapening. This is
Yes.
this is the one kind of the question, because this is how that social reproduction works.
Yes.
This is the without the cultural cheapening, that is the social reproduction is not possible. So this is one kind of the why do we have to read it in this particular way? The other one is a more a kind of a comment, I would say, in terms of in relation to the belatedness, that the but what you are bringing in terms of that the belatedness that of the native, of the within the how that the coloniality works, that the belatedness, I think it is always interesting to think together that the belatedness was a central theme, central aspect of modernity, debates of modernity and the modernization, because of, and it entails this kind of the teleology. And that we see, unfortunately, in the whole debates of migrants and migration and the refugees in scholarship, but also public debates, also here. So unfortunately, we're back to the modernization theories. So, I mean, we thought that there were so much, they were demolished. And the last point that I would just underline is that what you're talking about, the increasing culturalization as the depoliticization, actually the increasing culturalization is the politicization. So this, especially in the refugee debates and the migrants debates, it becomes the doing of politics, ways of doing politics. Of course, it takes us back to the question of importance of culture, that the use and abuse of culture in creation of value. And doing politics. Maybe I'll just stop, then we will take the questions. But if you would like to, for that the accumulation by dispossession, if you want to respond, you can. If not, then we could do it, take it, the questions, and Dan.
I'll just quickly respond to accumulation by dispossession, and my thinking here is formed partly with things with reading of people like Anat Singh and her critique of accumulation by dispossession. And what I think accumulation by dispossession lends itself to is a certain stagist rendition of what comes next. It lends itself to a stagist rendition of, there was accumulation by dispossession, then there was whatever we call it, imperialism, then there was this and so on. What I'm interested in is the struggles. It's the old Brenner-Wallerstein idea, an insistence still on the importance of the struggles and what continues to come from the struggles, and even the failed one and the resonances of this. What Raymond Williams called the residual aspects of that which has not been fully contained. by the exercise of power. So I mean, the idea of social production, struggles around social production, for me is a little bit, sheds more light on the relations involved.
Okay. Okay. I mean, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I think it's a very, I mean, it is a way of, it's a reading, because I think that we see all that kind of, these kind of stages, ideas, very much involved. And actually, if we do not see that, this kind of the devaluations involved in that, then denial of agencies are very easy. That in the rebellion in the tea plantation,
Exactly.
as you have shown, that is there could not be any kind of agency or any kind of resistance. So let me see whether we have questions. That someone is asking us that the getting a copy of your paper, but let's see. I mean, it's up to Prem, but I don't think that there is the paper right.
Not yet.
Yeah. which is we are very honored and we are very privileged, so that you share your ideas with us. Let me see whether that we have questions. That Ibrahim Soyfiren, thanking you for the inspiring talk. You use the term coloniality in order to analyze and understand migration. Do you think we can use the same approach for deportation? Do you have any particular suggestion or comment for someone like me who is trying to understand deportation in a historical and comparative perspective?
Yes, I mean, the way that I would think about it is through the lens of evictability, and how people have been rendered evictable. Certain groups of people are rendered evictable. I mean, you can see this whole idea of deportation as people who may be deported, who may be rendered evictable because of their imprints on society is tangential and fragile. And this is, of course, partly connected with work of Nicholas de Genova, of Hugh Van Baar, and other people who have talked about the evictability of people from territory, from social systems, and so on. And I think that this can very much be traced to a certain genealogy of colonialism, a certain history of colonialism. I hope that made sense. But I'd encourage you to look at de Genova and Hugh Van Baar as people to think with about this.
And we have a question from Caroline Breeden. Can you speak to the political potential of addressing migrants' movements and struggles as key to understanding society as a whole? How migrants could be politicized to be heralds of new political freedom, quote unquote?
I do think that the value of studying migration, which is what many people have done, including Aisha in your work, is in order to try to understand contemporary structures of power. You shed light on the center by studying the margins. I think Foucault said this. In terms of whether or not migrants could be politicized, be heralds of new political freedom, I don't know. Something about that is a little bit troubling for me. I mean, I do understand the possibilities of new communities, of new forms of solidarity that can be articulated. But I think these forms of articulation doesn't come from migrants themselves or migrants in their social relations before structures of political economic power. I think heralds or new forms of political community can really come, and excuse me if I sound like an old Marxist, and I'm not really very Marxist, can come from a rethinking of class relations and articulations. So thinking migrants in terms of their class articulations and their connections to other to other groups similarly commonly marginalized. So then to begin with a new history, an old history, to rethink forms of community and connection that have been derogated by the national imagination or by methodological nationalism.
Okay, I will just also come into that in terms of the whether they could be the heralds of that the freedom and the movements, and I think that this might not be what Prem is thinking, but I think it is important to think that the cultural cheapening might have 100 faces, very different forms, and then we should not be reading it only on its face value. Sometimes cultural valorization might be part of the cultural cheapening.
Yeah.
And political valorization. So I think this is a very interesting question to think through. Then we have the name I forgot. The what is the Joshi Lane? In your opinion, what are the biggest challenges for migrant prostitutes in the country of arrival, besides of the fear of being deported, for example, in the area of integration? I'm collecting, so there's another one. Helga Mitterbauer, thank you for your inspiring talk. I would like to add a question on blatantness. I agree with you that blatantness plays an important role in capitalism, but when we connect it with migration, we see that there are different types of quote-unquote migrants. If we think of expats, blatantness is at least less an issue than it is concerning migrant workers, harvest workers, for example. How do you see that?
Okay. Well, with regards to the first question, I mean, it's certainly not an area of which I know a lot. I don't work with people called prostitutes who are migrants. I would encourage you, I read just today with my class a very nice text by Enrica Rigo on the gendering of the border, where she traces the movement of young Nigerian women who are called trafficked. And one of the interesting points that she says is that in order for them to enter into this system of integration, was that they had to accept in Italy a procedure of rehabilitation, to be rehabilitated through, the example she had was Christian organizations, but not only Christian organizations, so that they could be recognized as victims who then could be rehabilitated. And I think part of the problem is here is a taking away of the complexity and agency and history of people that we identify as prostitutes or sex workers. So what's really important is this view of habilitation, and it connects, in the colonial context, to Anne Stoller's work about, the fear of I can't remember the term that she used, but basically of women of questionable morality, and how they needed to be rehabilitated. With regard to the second point, I should re-emphasize that the idea of belatedness is Shahram Khosravi's. I used it to connect it to enchantment. I think Shahram is here, so if you would like to say something about this, it's very welcome. But just the idea about different types of migrants, I think what I'm talking about is not migrants themselves. I'm working with a bunch of people working on this and decentering migrants and the idea of migration. We're thinking about people caught up in terms of cultural and social relations. So yes, expat workers who are typically in a very different relation to capitalism and capitalist production would have a very different sense of belatedness than migrant workers, or, for example, in Europe, racialized Roma labor.
Okay, we have, Prem, we have a couple of questions. Again, I will collect. And Andreas Streitzner, And I would be interested in how the situated manifestation of quote unquote finance or capital features in your approach. It seems the manifestation of labor come into view, but who extracts and appropriates less so? Keep it. I will move. Another one. Natalia Gomez. Thank you for your presentation. I'm interested in knowing how do you think this framework might be relevant to understand the programs for employability that are usually offered to migrants in their places of settlement, which are usually focused on technical skills to work in low pay industries. This is about the employability and how that kind of the marginalizations work. And Penelope Vargo, thank you for your presentation. You spoke about the commonality of marginalization and you referred to Roma people in Europe. Which specific commonalities do you, in relation to refugees and specific policies for Roma people in Europe, you see? And the last one, so that you could choose, because I know that you're tired, and then so that you could choose. This is a person who doesn't want to disclose his or her name. I am also interested in this question of the relationality of migration. You mentioned that you consider migration as a product of systemic processes rather than a situated decision governed by push-pull factors. Do you think that this analysis could also be extended to the question of post-colonial migrant integration in former colonies today?
In former colonies?
Yes.
Post-colonial migration. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you could pick however you want. I mean, we don't expect you to pick up everything, and then we know that it's tiring.
Well, I'll try and at least say something to each of these questions, right, if I can, if I can manage. Let me start, because I just have it down now. The commonalities with people with Roma. On the one hand, it's empirically evident that in some situations, I know the Hungarian situation better than other situations, Roma are racialized in their labor, which means a few things. One of my students is writing about how Roma women typically are sorry to my student who might be listening, I can't say because I'm tired, are typically consigned to work to do with care and social reproduction. But care and social reproduction for a ruling elite, working in catering, working in care for the, well, not care for elderly, but working in forms of care in very, sorry, I just say it very simply. It might be too ambitious for me to try to answer everything because I am feeling tired after a long time online. But the racializations that occur, the modes of immobilization that occur, immobilization, social immobilization of Roma through segregation in schools, through segregation in different parts of some cities, and also the forms of policies directed towards a so-called integration, which has centered on, I think, on trying to teach Roma how to perform civic virtue, often in how to work, how to labor. So the idea of workfare as a way of controlling racialized populations. And then there was the question about where finance and capital. And you're right. I mean, I don't have, my work is on the other side of things. I would strongly encourage you to look at people whom I like who do this, whom I mentioned, John Smith and Intan Suwadi, and someone else is Dimsky, I can't remember his first name now, I'm sorry, who talk about how the situated manifestations of finance or capital translate into firms acquiring both a legal and a political persona, or not persona, but personality at least, to be able to create and maintain durable structures of exploitation. So some of it is answered through the idea about the decentralization of legal authority. Other ways of answering this is by looking at how firms undertake or are able to undertake forms of exploitation with impunity. I'll cite my son, who was a university, who's just been writing about Shell's capacity to extract and occupy spaces of impunity in Nigeria.
Okay. Then maybe we could take the last question, and this is from Georgia Donna, who had actually who gave the inaugural lecture of the series. Thank you so much for such a stimulating talk. Contemporary European governmentality of migration unravels through administrative procedures, collection of information, dataification of narratives that are reminiscent of colonial forms of control. Could you comment on how colonial forms of resistance and disruptions, colonial control inform contemporary modalities of refugee, forced migrant resistance and disruptions? I think this gives you a chance that where you have to cut very shortly at the very end with the European citizen, and then connecting it to the refugees agency and resistance with the denial. And maybe you could pick this. It's a very important question, I think.
But if I understood rightly, the question is about the possibilities and genealogies of forms of resistance of people identified as refugees against these processes of surveilling and so on that occur. I mean, one of the things that I see in the archives, for example, in the attempt to make land and families available for tax purposes, was of course an attempt to destroy this colonial record, or attempt to corrupt this colonial record, an attempt to bring to the colonial record ideas and senses of the ownership of land and ideas of family and kin, which could not be so easily understood by the colonial record. And what I'm trying to get at that is the persistent attempt by people called natives to reassert their cultural systems, their cultural and social formations as ways of making sense and giving meaning and enchantment to the new social formations that they find themselves in. In terms of contemporary refugee resistance, and this maybe goes back to the questions that came from about the refugees as heralds of the new politicality. For me, what is important is trying to see how the rehistoricization and repoliticization of migration and of refugees, so they don't just appear as either suffering faces or people threatening people who need to be surveilled. If these histories and politicizations, these alternative ways of imagining living, can be reasserted as a form of resistance. I'm not sure whether I got that question entirely, but what I'm trying to get at is that in order to think refugee resistance, you need to be able to question the whole idea of refuginess and migration, and to locate these groups of people in terms of their complex histories and politics.
I think that is also, there is the one aspect that in the question is that the the pluralization of registers of cheapening and thus governance in the colonial policies, whether we see that kind of registers. I mean, at least this is how I see in one way, that in the today's world, in the kind of the governance and with those kind of administrative processes and everything, whether we see this kind of colonialization of that kind of registers and processes. I think that is also a very interesting aspect to look at it, and in your work, I mean, your talk enables us to think, I think.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to do here is to try to lay the basis for a book that I've been trying to find time and energy to write for quite a few years. And a lot of that is precisely on this, Aisha. I think that the multiple registers and contradictory registers of cheapening. And as you said earlier, also about how cultural valorization is, you know, is of a piece with cultural cheapening. What is this culturalization of migrants, and what sorts of purposes does it serve in terms of cohering modes of governance and cohering modes of production?
Okay, thank you very much, Prem, for this wonderful talk, and for all of you who had posed questions and remained with us, so that we could turn this into a discussion in terms of taking our thoughts further. Thank you very much, and we will pause in February, as I announced before. There will not be a seminar series in February, but mid-March there will be, and keep following us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Bye. Aisha, Anna, Clemens.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.